Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie buried in the classified archives of American military history? What if I told you that beneath the celebrated narrative of Native American service in the armed forces lies a disturbing chapter that the Pentagon has fought to keep hidden for decades? A series of experimental programs that used indigenous soldiers as unwitting test subjects, men who had volunteered to defend a country that had already taken so much from their people, only to be betrayed in ways that defy comprehension. Before we continue with this troubling story, take a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be brought into the light, please subscribe to help our channel continue uncovering the painful truths that shaped our nation. Your support allows us to preserve these stories that might otherwise remain buried forever. The year was 1943. As Allied forces battled across the Pacific and European theaters, a classified initiative known only by the codename Operation Thunderbird was quietly established at Fort Defiance, a remote military installation on the edge of the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona. Officially, the facility was designated as a specialized training center for Indigenous servicemen, particularly those with linguistic abilities valuable to the war effort. The public-facing mission to prepare Navajo, Apache, Hopi, and other tribal members for their roles as code talkers and intelligence specialists. But beneath this veneer of military necessity lay a program with far darker ambitions. Dr. William Calloway, a neuropsychiatrist who had previously conducted controversial research at Johns Hopkins University, was appointed as the scientific director of Operation Thunderbird. His official mandate, according to declassified memoranda discovered in 1994, was to explore the potential innate psychoperceptual capacities of indigenous subjects for enhanced battlefield awareness and communication. In less academic language, the military wanted to determine if Native American soldiers possessed special abilities that could be weaponized for warfare. This premise wasn't entirely without precedent. For decades, anthropologists and military observers had documented accounts of Apache scouts who could track enemies across seemingly impossible terrain. Navajo hunters who predicted weather changes with uncanny accuracy, and tribal elders who practiced forms of distance communication that defied conventional explanation. These phenomena, typically attributed to cultural knowledge and training, were reframed by Operation Thunderbird as potential biological or psychological advantages inherent to indigenous peoples. Subject selection must prioritize individuals with strong traditional upbringings and minimal Western educational influence, Calloway wrote in a memorandum dated April 12, 1943. Preference should be given to subjects who report experiences of special knowing, dream visions, or other paranormal phenomena consistent with their tribal traditions. The first phase of testing began with relatively benign psychological assessments, standard intelligence tests, perception exercises, and interview protocols designed to identify candidates for more intensive study. From an initial pool of 300 indigenous servicemen, 42 were selected for what was termed advanced training. 30, these men were segregated in a special barracks at Fort Defiance, told they were being prepared for elite reconnaissance missions that would utilize their unique cultural backgrounds. Private First Class Thomas Begay, a 20-year-old Navajo recruit from Chinle, Arizona, was among those selected. His personnel file, partially declassified in 2007, noted his exceptional visual acuity, spatial memory, and reported instances of precognitive dreaming. Similar notations appear in the files of other subjects, along with assessments of their traditional religious practices and family histories. They told us we were being trained for special missions behind enemy lines, recalled James Nez, one of the few surviving participants, in a 2011 interview with researchers from the Native American Veterans History Project. They said our people had ways of seeing and knowing that the white man didn't understand, and that these abilities could help win the war. We were proud to have been chosen. We thought we were going to be warriors in the oldest sense, using our traditional knowledge to protect our people. We had no idea what they really had planned for us. The second phase of Operation Thunderbird began in June 1943, when the facility received a shipment of experimental compounds from the Chemical Warfare Service Laboratory at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Among these was a derivative of mescaline, the psychoactive compound found in peyote, and a newly synthesized compound designated only as serum XB16. According to laboratory notes accompanying the shipment, these substances were believed to potentially enhance latent psychic abilities and heighten sensory perception beyond normal human limitations. What followed was a series of escalating experiments that would violate every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. The indigenous soldiers were initially told they were receiving traditional medicine that would strengthen their spiritual connection before deployment overseas. In reality, they were being systematically drugged with powerful psychotropic compounds and subjected to various forms of sensory manipulation and psychological stress. Sergeant Robert Tsosi, an Apache soldier from San Carlos, Arizona, described his experience in a handwritten journal discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1989. The medicine they gave us didn't feel like any herb or root I'd ever taken in ceremony. It burned in my veins and made the world shatter into pieces. Colors became sounds. Sounds became feelings. Time stopped making sense. They put me in a dark room with strange patterns projected on the walls and asked me to describe what I saw at another location miles away. When I couldn't do what they wanted, they increased the dose until I could barely remember my own name. According to facility records, the experiments typically followed a standardized protocol. Subjects were administered varying doses of psychoactive compounds, then placed in sensory deprivation chambers for periods ranging from 4 to 12 hours. During this time, they were given tasks designed to test for extrasensory perception, remote viewing, and precognitive abilities. These included attempting to identify images in sealed envelopes, describing distant locations they had never visited, and predicting the outcomes of randomly generated events. The results were meticulously documented, but yielded little of the paranormal data the researchers sought. Instead, the primary outcomes were severe psychological distress, hallucinations, and in several cases, complete psychological breaks requiring sedation and isolation. By September 1943, the scope of the experiments had expanded to include sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and the use of high-decibel sonic stimulation, all while subjects remained under the influence of increasingly potent psychoactive compounds. The justification, according to Calloway's research notes, was that traditional vision quests and warrior initiation rituals often involved physical hardship and sensory extremes, and that replicating these conditions might trigger latent abilities otherwise suppressed by conscious mental processes. The consequences were predictably catastrophic. Of the 42 indigenous soldiers originally selected for the program, records indicate that 7 died during the course of the experiments. The official causes of death were listed as training accidents or natural causes in communications to their families. 15 others suffered permanent psychological damage severe enough to require long-term institutionalization. The remaining subjects experienced varying degrees of trauma, many developing chronic conditions that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which at the time were dismissively labeled as shell shock or combat fatigue, despite the fact that these men had never left American soil. Perhaps most disturbing were the experiments conducted in what facility records referred to as Chamber 17. This specialized room, constructed in the basement level of the main research building, was designed for advanced perceptual isolation and targeted sensory input. Subjects placed in this chamber were administered the highest doses of serum XB16, then exposed to carefully orchestrated sensory stimuli, including pulsing lights, rhythmic sounds designed to mimic traditional drumming, and projected images of tribal religious symbols. They took away everything that made sense, recalled William Yazzie, another Navajo participant, in a recorded testimony provided to his family before his death in 1978. The walls breathed, the air had weight and color. They would show us pictures of places, military bases, airfields, shipyards, and ask us to go there in our minds, to see what was happening there. When we couldn't do it, they would increase the medicine and start again. Some men never came back from wherever the medicine sent them. Their bodies were still there, but their spirits, their minds, were gone. So, the most ambitious and ethically reprehensible phase of experimentation began in November 1943. Convinced that traditional Indigenous ceremonial contexts might be necessary to activate the desired abilities, Calloway's team constructed a mock ceremonial space based on superficial research into Navajo and Apache religious practices. They then forced the subjects to perform bastardized versions of sacred ceremonies while under the influence of serum XB16 and other compounds. This profound desecration of sacred traditions, combined with the extreme physiological and psychological stress of the experiments, led to the most severe adverse reactions yet documented in the program. 3 subjects died during this phase, with autopsy reports indicating extreme neurological distress consistent with seizures and cerebrovascular events. Several others experienced psychotic breaks so severe that they required physical restraints for days afterward. One participant, Corporal Joseph Tsinagini, managed to escape the facility during this period. He was found 3 days later, severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, wandering in the desert near Tuba City. Before being recaptured, he reportedly told a local Navajo family that they are breaking our spirits to see what's inside, and that the experiments are opening doors that should stay closed. After being returned to Fort Defiance, Tsinagini was listed as having been transferred to an unspecified medical facility. No further records of his whereabouts or condition have ever been found. By early 1944, even as the Operation Thunderbird experiments continued, concerns were beginning to emerge within the military command structure. Major General Harold Mitchell, during an inspection tour in February, reported to his superiors that the facility appeared to be pursuing speculative research of questionable military value at extreme human cost. His recommendations for a full review of the program were mysteriously countermanded, and Mitchell was reassigned to a combat command in the Pacific Theater shortly thereafter. Nevertheless, as the war progressed and resources were increasingly directed toward more conventional military efforts, funding for Operation Thunderbird began to diminish. In July 1944, the program was officially downsized, with many of the original subjects being processed for regular military service overseas or, if their condition precluded combat duty, quietly discharged with minimal benefits and strict confidentiality agreements. The facility remained operational, however, with a smaller cohort of subjects and a reoriented research focus. Having largely abandoned the pursuit of paranormal abilities, Calloway's team shifted toward studying how Indigenous soldiers responded to various forms of psychological conditioning and behavior modification. The new goal, according to internal documents, was to develop enhanced interrogation and indoctrination techniques based on observations of how traditional cultural frameworks could be systematically dismantled. This final phase, codenamed Project Whiteout, continued until March 1945. As Allied victory appeared increasingly certain, concerns about potential post-war investigations led military leadership to order the termination of the program and the comprehensive destruction of its records. The remaining subjects were either discharged with medical disqualifications or, in cases where their mental state was deemed too compromised or unpredictable, transferred to Veterans Administration psychiatric facilities with diagnoses that made no mention of their participation in classified research. Fort Defiance itself was rapidly decommissioned as a research facility and repurposed as a standard military training center before being returned to its original function as an Indian Health Service hospital in 1946. Physical evidence of Operation Thunderbird was systematically removed or disguised during this transition, with the underground levels where the most severe experiments had occurred being permanently sealed and concealed beneath new construction. For the men who had endured the program, the aftermath was a continuation of their nightmare. Those who attempted to speak about their experiences were dismissed as mentally unstable or threatened with prosecution under wartime secrecy laws. Many suffered in silence, their symptoms often worsened by alcohol or other substances used to self-medicate. The traditional healing practices that might have offered some solace were often inaccessible to veterans living away from their communities, and Western psychiatric treatment of the era was both inadequate and culturally inappropriate for their specific trauma. "They broke something inside us," James Nez said in his later testimony. "Not just our minds, but our connection to our ways, our ceremonies, our identity as Diné, Navajo. When they forced those sacred things into their experiments, they poisoned them for us." Many of the men could never participate in ceremonies again without flashbacks or panic. They couldn't hear the traditional songs without being taken back to that place of terror. So, they lost their culture, their community, their way of healing, exactly when they needed it most. To Dean, the story of Operation Thunderbird might have remained buried forever if not for a series of improbable discoveries beginning in the 1990s. During renovations at the Fort Defiance Hospital in 1993, construction workers uncovered a sealed room containing several boxes of microfilm that had apparently been overlooked during the original purge of records. These materials, while fragmentary, provided the first documentary evidence of the program's existence and general parameters. Concurrently, the Native American Veterans History Project, established to document the often overlooked contributions of Indigenous service members, began recording the testimonies of elderly veterans from World War II. Among these were several survivors of Operation Thunderbird who, in their final years, chose to break decades of silence about their experiences. These converging streams of evidence eventually attracted the attention of investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez, whose 1997 series of articles in the Arizona Republic first brought the story to public attention. Her work prompted a congressional inquiry, though the resulting investigation was hampered by the continued classification of most relevant documents and the advanced age or death of many key witnesses. In 2001, a limited acknowledgement came in the form of a Department of Defense memorandum that admitted to certain experimental protocols involving Native American servicemen, having been conducted at Fort Defiance during World War II. The statement characterized these as products of an earlier era's different ethical standards, and extended a vague apology to affected communities. No specific details, accountability measures, or compensation provisions were included. A more comprehensive reckoning came through a class action lawsuit filed in 2003 on behalf of surviving participants and the families of those deceased. After years of legal battles and forced declassification of additional documents, a settlement was reached in 2011. The agreement included financial compensation for survivors and their immediate families, funding for mental health programs in affected tribal communities, and the establishment of a historical commission to fully document the program and its impacts. Despite these measures, many aspects of Operation Thunderbird remain shrouded in secrecy. Large portions of the program's records are still classified as top secret, with government attorneys continuing to argue that their release would compromise still relevant national security protocols. The full chemical composition of serum XB16 has never been disclosed, nor have the specific parameters of many experimental procedures. The ultimate fate of several participants, including Joseph Tsinagini and others who disappeared into the military medical system, remains unknown. For indigenous communities, particularly the Navajo Nation, which lost the greatest number of men to the program, the wounds remain raw. Traditional healers and cultural leaders have worked to develop specialized ceremonies for the survivors and their families, attempting to address not only the personal trauma, but also the spiritual violation inherent in the program's misappropriation of sacred practices. This was not just an attack on individuals, but on our way of life, our spiritual foundations, explained Dr. Irene Begay, a Navajo psychologist who has worked extensively with Operation Thunderbird survivors and their descendants. When they took our sacred ceremonies and corrupted them for these experiments, they committed a kind of spiritual violence that ripples through generations. The damage isn't limited to those directly involved. It affects our collective cultural memory, our relationship with our own traditions. Botaninta, the story of Operation Thunderbird, stands as a stark reminder of the darkest intersections of scientific arrogance, military expediency, and racial exploitation. It represents a chapter in American history that defies the convenient narratives of progress and enlightenment, revealing instead the persistent willingness to sacrifice the most vulnerable in pursuit of power and advantage. For the indigenous soldiers who endured these experiments, their experience embodied a cruel irony. They had volunteered to fight for a country built on land taken from their ancestors, only to become victims of that same country's exploitation. Many had joined the military despite their community's painful history with the American government, believing that their service might at last earn them recognition as full and equal citizens. Instead, they were treated as expendable test subjects, their unique cultural heritage not honored but weaponized against them. The legacy of Operation Thunderbird extends beyond the immediate horror of the experiments themselves. It raises profound questions about the ethics of military research, the protection of vulnerable populations, and the ongoing impact of historical traumas on indigenous communities. It challenges us to consider how many other such programs might remain hidden in classified archives, their victims still carrying unacknowledged wounds. In recent years, some measure of healing has begun through the breaking of silence. At monuments honoring Native American veterans across the country, special ceremonies now acknowledge those who suffered in secret programs like Operation Thunderbird. Oral history projects work to preserve the testimonies of survivors, ensuring that their experiences will not be forgotten as they pass from this world. Educational initiatives within tribal communities, and increasingly in mainstream institutions, are incorporating these narratives into a more complete understanding of American history. Yet the fullest accounting and the deepest healing remains elusive so long as government secrecy persists. Advocates continue to press for complete declassification of all records related to the program, arguing that national security cannot justifiably be invoked to shield actions taken nearly 8 decades ago against American citizens. The experiments at Fort Defiance aren't just history. They're still happening in the minds of the survivors, in the grief of families who never knew why their fathers or grandfathers came home broken, in the communities that lost cultural knowledge when these men could no longer participate in ceremonies, said Robert Thompson, an attorney who worked on the class action lawsuit. Every day that the full truth remains classified is another day that this wound cannot properly heal. As the generation that experienced these horrors firsthand passes away, the urgency of full disclosure only grows. The last known survivor of Operation Thunderbird, Albert Hale, died in 2018 at the age of 96. In one of his final interviews, he expressed his hope that the complete story would emerge within his lifetime, a hope that went unfulfilled. "I don't have much time left," Hale said then, his voice frail but determined. "But this isn't just about me or even my generation. It's about truth. It's about making sure nothing like this happens again. They tried to use our spiritual ways against us, to break something sacred for their war. That story needs to be told completely, no matter how much it hurts to hear it." The experiments at Fort Defiance represent one of the most extreme examples of a broader pattern, in which indigenous peoples have been subjected to unethical medical and scientific practices without their informed consent. From the notorious Tuskegee syphilis study to the thousands of forced sterilizations performed on Native American women in the 1970s, the American medical and scientific establishment has a long history of viewing certain populations as legitimate subjects for experimentation rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and protection. This pattern reflects deeper currents in American society: the persistent devaluation of indigenous lives, the arrogant dismissal of non-Western knowledge systems, and the willingness to sacrifice ethical principles in the name of national security or scientific progress. Operation Thunderbird was not an aberration, but rather a particularly extreme manifestation of these tendencies, made possible by the secrecy and urgency of wartime. As we continue to uncover and reckon with this history, perhaps the most important question is not simply what happened at Fort Defiance between 1943 and 1945, but what it reveals about the society that allowed it to happen, and what responsibility we bear, decades later, to ensure that such abuses never occur again. The story of Operation Thunderbird is not yet complete. Documents remain classified, questions unanswered, accountabilities unassigned. But what we know already challenges us to look more critically at our collective past and to listen more attentively to the voices that have too often been silenced in our national narrative. In the words of Thomas Begay, the young Navajo soldier whose personnel file first hinted at the program's true nature, what they did to us in that place was a kind of murder. Some died with their bodies, others with their minds, but all of us lost something that can never be given back. The least they can do is tell the truth about what happened, not just for us, but for the country to know what was done in its name. The truth, however painful, is essential for healing. And the story of Operation Thunderbird, of what Americans really did to indigenous soldiers during these secret war experiments, is a truth that demands to be fully told. While Operation Thunderbird officially ended with the conclusion of World War II, declassified documents and survivor testimonies reveal that the research didn't simply disappear, it evolved. In 1952, as Cold War tensions escalated and fears of Soviet psychic research programs spread through American intelligence circles, a new classified initiative emerged from the ashes of the Fort Defiance experiments, codenamed Project Dreamwalker. This successor program operated with greater secrecy and a more sophisticated understanding of both indigenous cultural practices and the emerging science of neuropsychology. Instead of the crude, brutally direct methods employed at Fort Defiance, Dreamwalker utilized more subtle approaches, though these would ultimately prove no less devastating to its subjects. The program was established at a nondescript facility outside Gallup, New Mexico, officially designated as a specialized rehabilitation center for Native American veterans experiencing readjustment difficulties. In reality, the facility served as a screening center where indigenous veterans showing specific psychological profiles or reporting experiences with traditional spiritual practices were identified and recruited for further treatment. They came to the reservation looking for men who were having trouble after Korea, recalled Daniel Sosi, whose father Harold was among those recruited into Project Dreamwalker. Said they had a special program just for Native vets, with doctors who understood our traditions. My father was having nightmares, drinking too much. He thought they were offering help. By the time we realized what was really happening, it was too late. Unlike Operation Thunderbird, which had focused primarily on attempting to induce and weaponize supposed psychic abilities, Project Dreamwalker had a more ambitious and insidious goal: to develop techniques for psychological manipulation by studying how traditional indigenous belief systems could be systematically dismantled and reconstructed. The ultimate aim: according to a partially declassified 1953 memorandum, was to create methods of ideological conversion applicable to diverse cultural contexts in strategic foreign theaters. In simpler terms, they were developing advanced brainwashing techniques using Native American veterans as test cases. Dr. Martin Chambers, the Harvard-educated psychiatrist who served as Dreamwalker's scientific director, had studied the Fort Defiance records extensively before designing his new methodologies. His approach centered on what he termed cultural deconstruction and reformulation, a process that began by identifying the core spiritual and cultural frameworks that structured a subject's understanding of reality, then systematically attacking and replacing these frameworks with alternatives that could be controlled by the experimenters. Subject K-17 demonstrates the theoretical potential of the procedure, Chambers wrote in one recovered case file. Having successfully disrupted his traditional cosmological framework through targeted pharmaceutical intervention and controlled environmental stimuli, we have now implanted a revised belief structure that maintains the formal characteristics of Navajo spiritual practice while redirecting loyalty and metaphysical authority to designated control figures. The pharmaceutical intervention referenced in Chambers' clinical language consisted of carefully calibrated combinations of psychoactive compounds, including refined versions of the serum XB16 originally developed for Operation Thunderbird. These were administered in cycles designed to first destabilize the subject's psychological equilibrium, then render them receptive to new beliefs during periods of relative clarity. The controlled environmental stimuli were even more disturbing. Drawing on both traditional interrogation methods and emerging research in sensory manipulation, Dreamwalker researchers constructed specialized chambers where subjects were exposed to carefully orchestrated sensory experiences. These included recordings of traditional ceremonies that had been subtly altered to induce disorientation, visual projections that distorted sacred symbols, and simulated presences that mimicked spiritual entities recognized in native traditions but behaved in ways that contradicted traditional understanding. They made us doubt everything we had ever known, explained John Bentley, one of the few Dreamwalker subjects who later spoke publicly about his experiences in testimony provided to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 1977. First, they would use the drugs to break down your mind, make you vulnerable. Then they would show you things that seemed like the holy people from our traditions, but wrong somehow. These false holy people would tell you that everything you had learned from your elders was a misunderstanding, that there were deeper truths they were now revealing. After months of this, you couldn't trust your own thoughts anymore. You became whatever they told you to be. The program's scope was considerably smaller than Operation Thunderbird. Documents suggest a total of 38 subjects participated between 1952 and 1960, but its methods were more refined and its ambitions more explicitly focused on psychological warfare applications. The researchers meticulously documented the breakdown of each subject's cultural identity and the construction of new, artificial belief systems that could be manipulated by external authorities. Most disturbing were the field tests conducted in the later stages of the program. Once researchers believed they had successfully reconstructed a subject's belief system, the individual would be returned to their community for brief periods, closely monitored to assess how well the implanted beliefs withstood exposure to familiar cultural contexts. These tests often had devastating consequences, not only for the subjects, but for their communities. When my father came home that first time, we knew something was deeply wrong. Daniel Tsosi continued in his account. He performed ceremonies, but the words were changed in subtle ways. He told stories about the holy people that contradicted everything we had been taught. When the elders questioned him, he became agitated, insisting he had received new revelations that superseded traditional knowledge. He created divisions in our community, turned family against family. Later we learned this was exactly what they were hoping for. to see if their methods could not just break one person, but spread disruption through an entire cultural system. These field tests appear to have been particularly focused on reservation communities with histories of resistance to government policies. Project Dreamwalker's secondary objective, according to a heavily redacted planning document, included developing pacification methodologies applicable to indigenous resistance movements in strategic overseas territories, likely a reference to the growing anti-colonial struggles in regions considered vital to American Cold War interests. The program's ultimate goal was to refine these techniques for use against enemy populations, particularly in regions where traditional cultural systems remained strong. The indigenous veterans were merely convenient test subjects, culturally distinct from mainstream America, already psychologically vulnerable from war experiences and, critically, unlikely to be believed if they attempted to report what was being done to them. By the late 1950s, Project Dreamwalker had compiled an extensive database of techniques for cultural and psychological manipulation. These were formalized in a classified manual titled Strategic Cultural Intervention Protocols, excerpts of which were later discovered among the personal papers of a former military psychologist. The manual included detailed methodologies for identifying cultural pressure points, beliefs or practices that, when targeted, could destabilize an entire cultural system, and strategies for exploiting these vulnerabilities to reshape both individual and collective behavior. As the program continued, however, unforeseen complications emerged. Many of the subjects began to experience severe psychological deterioration beyond what the researchers had anticipated or desired. The implanted belief systems proved unstable, often collapsing catastrophically and leaving subjects in states of profound dissociation. Others developed complex delusions that incorporated elements of both their traditional beliefs and the artificial constructs imposed by the experiments, resulting in unpredictable and sometimes violent behavior. We may have underestimated the resilience and complexity of indigenous spiritual frameworks, Chambers acknowledged in a 1959 assessment. Subject responses suggest that these belief systems are more deeply integrated with identity formation than our models predicted. Attempting to modify them with our current methods produces unacceptable levels of collateral psychological damage. This collateral damage manifested in alarming statistics. Of the 38 documented subjects, 11 committed suicide within 5 years of their participation. 14 others were eventually committed to long-term psychiatric institutions, with conditions ranging from catatonic states to violent psychosis. Most of the remainder lived lives marked by alcoholism, broken relationships, and an inability to reintegrate into either mainstream American society or their tribal communities. Perhaps most tragic were the ripple effects through families and communities. Children and grandchildren of Dreamwalker subjects have reported patterns of intergenerational trauma, spiritual confusion, and cultural disconnection that persist to the present day. In some cases, the distorted teachings introduced by subjects during field tests created lasting divisions within tribal communities, disrupting traditional knowledge transmission and ceremonial practices that had survived centuries of outside pressure. They didn't just break my father. They broke something in our family line, explained Mary Tsosi, daughter of Harold Tsosi. I grew up not knowing what to believe, caught between the traditional teachings of my grandparents and the strange, twisted version my father brought back from that place. My own children now feel disconnected from their heritage, uncertain about which practices are authentic and which might be contaminated by those experiments. The damage doesn't stop with one generation. Project Dreamwalker was officially terminated in 1961 as shifting priorities within the military and intelligence communities directed resources toward other approaches to psychological warfare. The facility near Gallup was decommissioned, records were either destroyed or sealed under the highest classification levels, and subjects still under direct supervision were transferred to various Veterans Administration facilities with their connection to classified research carefully concealed in their medical records. As with Operation Thunderbird before it, the story of Project Dreamwalker might have remained buried in classified archives if not for a series of unexpected exposures beginning in the 1970s. The first breakthrough came during the Church Committee investigations of 1975 and 1976, when congressional investigators examining CIA mind control programs such as MKUltra discovered cross-references to the Dreamwalker protocols. Although the committee's primary focus remained on better-known programs, these references led to a supplementary investigation that included closed-door testimony from John Benally and 2 other Dreamwalker survivors. This testimony, only partially declassified in 2009, provided the first official acknowledgement of the program's existence and general parameters. Further revelations came through the persistent efforts of Indigenous activists, particularly those involved in the American Indian movement, who connected families of affected veterans and helped document patterns of trauma and psychological damage that could not be explained by conventional combat experiences. Their advocacy eventually attracted the attention of investigative journalists like Peter Williams, whose 1983 book, The Invisible Battlefield. Secret experiments on Native American veterans first brought the Dreamwalker story to broader public attention. By the early 1990s, sufficient evidence had accumulated to support a class action lawsuit against the federal government on behalf of Dreamwalker subjects and their families. The case, Standing Bear versus United States, faced years of procedural obstacles as government attorneys invoked national security privileges to block discovery of relevant documents. A partial settlement was eventually reached in 1997, providing limited financial compensation to survivors and their immediate families, but including a problematic immunity clause that prevented further litigation and left many questions unanswered. The most complete accounting of Project Dreamwalker to date emerged from the Special Commission on Classified Human Experimentation, established by congressional mandate in 2004. After 3 years of investigation, including interviews with former program personnel protected by limited immunity agreements, the Commission released a 500-page report documenting the program's methods, objectives, and consequences in unprecedented detail. The report concluded that Project Dreamwalker constituted a severe violation of ethical standards for human research, a betrayal of the trust placed in medical and military authorities by vulnerable veterans, and a profound assault on the cultural integrity of affected Indigenous communities. It recommended a comprehensive program of reparations, mental health services, cultural restoration initiatives, and full declassification of all related documents. These recommendations were only partially implemented. While additional compensation was provided to identified victims and their families, and some support programs were established in affected communities, the government continued to resist full disclosure. Approximately 30% of Dreamwalker records remain classified even today, with officials maintaining that certain technical aspects of the research remain relevant to national security concerns. For survivors and their descendants, these ongoing classifications represent not just an obstacle to historical truth, but a continuation of the original violation. The withholding of information about what was done to them, what chemicals they were given, what psychological techniques were used, what false beliefs might still be influencing their worldview, extends the loss of agency that characterized the original experiments. How can we fully heal when we still don't know exactly what was done to us? Asked Raymond Bigay, son of a Dreamwalker subject, at a 2017 congressional hearing on Indigenous veterans issues. These experiments didn't just happen in the past. They live on in our bodies, in our minds, in our broken family relationships, in our disconnection from our traditions. We have a right to know everything, not just for closure, but for our ongoing healing. The legacy of Project Dreamwalker extends beyond the immediate circle of those directly affected. For many indigenous communities, the program represents one of the most extreme examples of a broader pattern of exploitation and cultural assault. The deliberate targeting of sacred knowledge and spiritual practices, treating them not as valid belief systems worthy of respect, but as psychological mechanisms to be manipulated, echoes centuries of colonial attitudes that have classified indigenous worldviews as primitive superstitions rather than complex knowledge systems. This perspective was explicitly articulated in Chambers' own writings about the program. In a personal journal discovered after his death in 1987, he wrote, "The beauty of using indigenous belief systems as our experimental model is that they represent a simpler, more accessible version of the universal psychological structures underlying all human religions and cultural frameworks. By learning to dismantle and reconstruct these relatively primitive systems, we develop techniques that can be scaled and adapted to more complex ideological structures." Such attitudes reflect a profound misunderstanding of indigenous knowledge systems, which often encompass sophisticated cosmological models, complex ethical frameworks, and detailed observational knowledge developed over countless generations. The damage done by Project Dreamwalker was not just to individuals, but to these knowledge systems themselves, creating distrust and disruption that have impeded cultural transmission and healing. The intergenerational impacts have been particularly severe. Children and grandchildren of subjects often grew up in environments
At 11:15 on the morning of April 9, 1944, Lieutenant Commander George Castleman stood on the bridge of USS Pillsbury, watching a German submarine break the surface 700 yards off his starboard bow. 10 months commanding a destroyer escort, dozens of depth-charge attacks, 0 captures. The U-boat that had just surfaced was U-515, commanded by one of Germany's deadliest submarine aces. Werner Henke had sunk 25 Allied ships. Over 600 men, women, and children had drowned when he torpedoed the British troopship Ceramic in December 1942. Now Henke's boat was crippled, forced to the surface by hours of relentless depth charging from Pillsbury and her sister ships. The German crew scrambled onto the deck. Some manned their guns, others jumped into the Atlantic. Castleman's ship opened fire. So did USS Flaherty. Machine guns raked the submarine's conning tower. Rockets streaked across the water from aircraft circling overhead. Within minutes, U-515's bow lifted toward the sky. She slid backward into the Atlantic and disappeared. 44 German sailors were pulled from the water, including Henke himself. The task group had destroyed one of Germany's most successful U-boats. By every measure, it was a victory. But Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, and the entire hunter-killer group, saw something else entirely. He saw a missed opportunity. Gallery had watched U-515 float on the surface for nearly 10 minutes before she sank. 10 minutes. In that time, his ships had done exactly what the Navy had trained them to do. They had destroyed the enemy. But Gallery realized that if he had been ready, if he had trained boarding parties in advance, he might have captured the submarine instead. The intelligence value would have been extraordinary. German codebooks, Enigma cipher machines, torpedo guidance systems, acoustic homing technology. The Allies had been trying to crack German naval codes for years. A captured U-boat could hand them everything. No American warship had boarded and captured an enemy vessel at sea since 1815, the War of 1812, 129 years. The Navy did not train sailors for boarding actions. There were no procedures, no protocols. No one had even considered it possible. Gallery decided to change that. The problem was immense. German U-boat crews were trained to scuttle their boats within minutes of surfacing. They opened sea valves, they set demolition charges, they destroyed codebooks and smashed equipment. Even if American sailors could reach a surface submarine, they would be boarding a sinking ship rigged with explosives. The Germans would rather die than let their secrets fall into Allied hands. And the statistics were brutal. In 1943 alone, German submarines had sunk over 300 Allied merchant ships. American destroyer escorts hunting U-boats faced a simple equation: find the submarine, destroy it before it destroys you. There was no time for boarding parties, no margin for error. Every second a U-boat remained afloat was another second it could fire torpedoes. Castleman's Pillsbury was an Edsel-class destroyer escort, 1,200 tons, 3-inch guns, depth charges, and hedgehog mortars. She was built to hunt and kill submarines, not to capture them. But Gallery had given the order. Every ship in Task Group 22.3 would form a boarding party. They would train, they would prepare, and on their next patrol, they would try something the United States Navy had not attempted in over a century. If you want to see how Castleman's crew prepared for an impossible mission, please hit that like button. It helps us bring these forgotten stories to more viewers. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Pillsbury. The task group returned to Norfolk in late April. Castleman assembled his best men. He told them they were going to board a German submarine. They had 6 weeks to figure out how. On May 15, 1944, Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk with a new mission. The official orders said routine anti-submarine patrol, but Gallery had received secret authorization from the highest levels of naval command. Bring one back alive. The boarding party from Pillsbury consisted of 8 men. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David would lead them. He was 41 years old, a former enlisted sailor who had worked his way up through the ranks over 25 years in the Navy. He served as the ship's assistant engineering officer. He knew machinery. He knew pipes and valves and how ships stayed afloat. David had never boarded an enemy vessel. No one in the United States Navy had, not in living memory. The training began immediately after Pillsbury left Norfolk. Every day, David drilled his men on the fantail. They practiced climbing over railings. They rehearsed jumping from a whaleboat onto a moving deck. They memorized the general layout of a German Type 9 submarine based on intelligence photographs and technical drawings. The challenges were staggering. A surfaced U-boat would be circling erratically, its rudder likely jammed by depth charge damage. The deck would be slick with seawater and fuel oil. German sailors might still be aboard, armed and desperate. The submarine could dive at any moment, taking the boarding party down with it. And then there were the explosives. German commanders followed strict protocols for scuttling. The moment a U-boat surfaced under attack, the captain would order demolition charges armed. These were placed throughout the submarine, designed to detonate and send the boat to the bottom within minutes. The crew would also open sea valves, flooding the engine room and control spaces. Even if American sailors reached the submarine, they would be entering a vessel that was simultaneously sinking and rigged to explode. David's team had to work fast. They estimated 3 to 5 minutes from boarding to catastrophic flooding. In that window, they needed to locate and disarm demolition charges, find and close sea valves, and stop whatever other scuttling measures the Germans had initiated, all while navigating the cramped, unfamiliar interior of a foreign submarine in near darkness. The tools were basic: wrenches, flashlights, sidearms. There was no specialized equipment for capturing enemy submarines because no one had ever needed any. Gallery held conferences with his destroyer escort captains throughout the 3-week voyage. Commander Frederick Hall coordinated the tactical approach. The plan called for careful use of weapons once a U-boat surfaced. Ships would fire small-caliber guns only, enough to drive the German crew overboard, but not enough to sink the submarine. Aircraft would strafe the decks to prevent the enemy from manning their guns, but pilots were ordered to avoid hits below the waterline. The goal was to wound the submarine, not kill it. Pillsbury's role was critical. She would be the first ship to lower a boarding party. Castleman positioned his whaleboat crews for rapid deployment. The moment a U-boat broke the surface, David and his men would be over the side and racing toward it. There was no guarantee the plan would work. The Navy had never attempted anything like this. Intelligence suggested that German crews could complete scuttling procedures in under 4 minutes. If David's team was even 30 seconds too slow, they would go down with the submarine. The task group sailed south toward the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa. Intelligence reports indicated U-boat activity in the shipping lanes. Guadalcanal's aircraft flew constant patrols, searching for periscopes and snorkel masts. Days passed without contact. The men grew restless. David continued drilling his boarding party, but the repetition wore on them. They had memorized every procedure. They had rehearsed every scenario. Now, they simply waited. On the morning of June 4th, 1944, the task group was 150 miles west of Cape Blanco. Gallery had ordered a course change to head for Casablanca to refuel. The patrol seemed finished. At 11:09, the sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported contact. Bearing 045, range 800 yards. A submarine was running submerged directly toward the carrier Guadalcanal. David's team had trained for 6 weeks. Now they had minutes. Chatelaine turned hard to starboard and accelerated toward the contact. 2 FM-2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal dove toward the sea, their pilots spotting the dark shape of a submarine running just below the surface. They opened fire with their machine guns, stitching lines of spray across the water to mark the position for the destroyers below. At 11:16, Chatelaine released her first pattern of depth charges. The explosion sent white columns of water erupting skyward. Oil bubbled to the surface. The submarine was hit. 6.5 minutes after the first attack, the U-boat broke the surface 700 yards from Chatelaine. She came up bow first, her gray hull streaming seawater, her conning tower scarred with rust. The depth charges had jammed her rudder. Her lights were out. Seawater poured through cracked pipes in her engine room. The submarine began circling to starboard at 5 or 6 knots, unable to steer. German sailors scrambled through the hatches onto the deck. Some tried to reach their deck guns. Chatelaine and the other escorts opened fire with everything that would bear. Machine gun rounds sparked off the conning tower. A German sailor fell dead on the deck. The rest threw up their hands and began jumping into the Atlantic. On Pillsbury's bridge, Castleman watched the submarine spiral through the water. This was the moment. He gave the order to lower the whaleboat. David and his 8-man team were already waiting. They dropped into the boat and cast off, the coxswain steering directly into the submarine's circling path. The U-boat was still moving, still turning. They would have to intercept it like chasing a wounded animal. The whaleboat cut inside the submarine's arc. The men could see the gray hull looming larger with each second. Oil slicked the water around them. German sailors thrashed in the waves nearby, shouting and waving for rescue. David ignored them. His focus was the submarine. The whaleboat pulled alongside. The hull was slick with oil and seawater. David grabbed a railing and pulled himself onto the deck. His men followed. The submarine rolled beneath their feet, still circling, still sinking by the stern. One German body lay face down near the conning tower hatch. No other enemy sailors were visible. David did not hesitate. He climbed through the hatch and dropped into the control room. The interior was nearly dark. Emergency lighting cast red shadows across unfamiliar machinery. Water sprayed from broken pipes. The deck was tilted at an angle. The submarine was flooding. David could hear the rush of seawater somewhere below. The Germans had opened the sea valves before abandoning ship. He had minutes, maybe less, before the boat went down. His men spread through the compartments. One found the sea strainer valve, a large pipe allowing ocean water to flood the bilges. The cover had been removed and thrown aside. He located it nearby and screwed it back into place. The flooding slowed. Others searched for demolition charges. They found 13 throughout the submarine, placed in the engine room, the torpedo compartments, the control spaces. Each one had to be located, examined, and disarmed. The charges had timers. Some were set to detonate within minutes. David's team worked in near darkness, crawling through oily water, tracing unfamiliar pipes and cables. They pulled wires. They removed detonators. They sealed valves and hatches. The submarine continued to settle by the stern, her aft deck already submerged. Above them, the circling submarine posed a new danger. Without steering, the U-boat swung toward Pillsbury herself. Castleman had to maneuver his ship to avoid collision. The whaleboat that had delivered David's team was crushed between the two hulls. 3 of Pillsbury's compartments flooded from the impact, but the boarding party stayed aboard the submarine. They had stopped the scuttling. The U-boat was wounded, but she was not sinking. At 11:30, a second boarding party arrived from Guadalcanal, led by Commander Earl Trocino, the carrier's chief engineer. He found David's men still working in the flooded compartments, still pulling demolition charges from hidden corners. They had captured a German submarine. Now they had to keep her afloat. Commander Trissino crawled through the flooded compartments for hours. He was a merchant marine engineer before the war, experienced with ship's systems and machinery, but he had never been inside a German submarine. No American had. The Type 9 U-boat was larger than he expected, over 250 feet long, 11 compartments connected by watertight hatches. The design was foreign, the labels in German, the equipment unfamiliar. Trissino traced pipelines by hand, following them through the oily bilge water until he understood how the submarine's systems connected. The stern was already underwater. The depth charge damage had cracked pipes and ruptured tanks throughout the aft section. Seawater continued to seep in through dozens of small leaks. If they could not stop the flooding, the submarine would sink within hours. Trissino organized the salvage effort. He directed men to specific valves. He identified which pumps still functioned. He jury-rigged connections between compartments to redirect the flow of water. Slowly, the flooding stabilized. While Trissino worked on keeping the submarine afloat, David's team collected intelligence materials. They found 2 Enigma cipher machines intact, complete with their coding rotors. They gathered stacks of codebooks, signal documents, and operational orders. They located charts showing U-boat patrol zones across the Atlantic. 900 pounds of classified German naval documents. The haul was extraordinary. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain had been working to crack German naval communications for years. They had achieved partial success, but the Germans regularly changed their cipher settings. Fresh codebooks and an intact Enigma machine could unlock months of intercepted messages. But there was more. In the forward torpedo room, the salvage teams found 2 acoustic homing torpedoes. The Germans called them Zaunkönig. The Allies had heard rumors of these weapons, but had never examined one. The torpedoes used sound to track their targets, homing in on the propeller noise of Allied ships. Understanding how they worked could save hundreds of lives. Captain Gallery faced an immediate problem. His task group was now responsible for a captured enemy submarine 150 miles off the African coast. The U-boat could not move under her own power. She was barely staying afloat. And 3,000 American sailors had just witnessed her capture. If the Germans learned that U-505 had been taken intact, they would change their codes immediately. Every advantage gained from the captured materials would vanish. The entire operation would be worthless. Gallery ordered absolute secrecy. No radio transmissions about the capture. No written records in ship logs. The German prisoners, 58 men including their wounded captain, were confined below decks on Guadalcanal, forbidden from speaking with anyone. Then, Gallery received new orders from Washington. The original plan had been to tow the submarine to Casablanca. Now, he was directed to take her to Bermuda instead. 2,500 miles across the open Atlantic. The timing was critical. Allied forces were about to invade Normandy. D-Day was scheduled for June 5th, pushed to June 6th due to weather. If German intelligence discovered that their codes had been compromised days before the largest amphibious invasion in history, the consequences could be catastrophic. Pillsbury attempted to take the submarine under tow, but the collision during the capture had damaged her hull. 3 compartments were flooded. She could not maintain the strain. Guadalcanal herself rigged a tow line from the carrier to the U-boat and began the slow journey north. The voyage took 15 days. Storms threatened to swamp the waterlogged submarine. Salvage crews remained aboard around the clock, pumping water and monitoring leaks. The fleet tug USS Abnaki eventually took over towing duties, but the danger never lessened. On June 19th, the task group entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. The U-boat was immediately hidden in a remote corner of the naval base. She was repainted to disguise her German origins and given a new designation, USS Nemo. The 58 German prisoners were transferred to a secret camp in Louisiana. The Red Cross was denied access. Their families in Germany received notifications that they were missing, presumed dead. They would not learn the truth until 1947. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, reviewed the intelligence haul. The codebooks alone were invaluable, but King had another concern. Gallery had taken an enormous risk. If the capture had failed, if the Germans had learned their codes were compromised, the damage to Allied operations could have been incalculable. The Admiral's response was measured. Gallery would receive the Legion of Merit, but he would also receive a private warning. The secrecy had to hold. If it did not, there would be consequences. The German Navy never learned what happened to U-505. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, received the final transmission from the submarine on June 3rd. She reported her position off the African coast and indicated she was returning to base in Lorient, France. After June 4th, silence. This was not unusual. U-boats disappeared constantly in 1944. Allied hunter-killer groups and long-range aircraft had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for German submarines. Donitz assumed U-505 had been sunk by depth charges or aerial attack, like hundreds of others before her. He ordered no changes to German codes. He issued no warnings about compromised communications. The Kriegsmarine continued using the same Enigma settings, the same cipher procedures, the same operational protocols. The secrecy held. 3,000 American sailors who had witnessed the capture said nothing. They wrote no letters home describing what they had seen. They made no mentions in personal diaries. Captain Gallery had explained the stakes during the voyage to Bermuda. If word reached the Germans, the intelligence value would be destroyed. Allied sailors and soldiers would die because of loose talk. The men understood. Not a single breach occurred. At Bletchley Park in England, British codebreakers received the captured materials within weeks. The Enigma machine and its rotors confirmed their understanding of German cipher methods. The codebooks provided settings valid through the summer of 1944. Intercepted U-boat transmissions that had been gibberish suddenly became readable. The intelligence revealed German submarine positions across the Atlantic. It exposed patrol patterns and attack strategies. It identified supply routes and rendezvous points. Allied convoy commanders adjusted their courses to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Hunter-killer groups received precise coordinates for their targets. The acoustic homing torpedoes proved equally valuable. American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington disassembled the Zonkonig weapons and analyzed every component. They discovered the torpedoes tracked the cavitation noise created by ship propellers. Within months, the Navy developed countermeasures. Ships began towing noisemakers called foxers, decoys that produced louder cavitation sounds than the ships themselves. The torpedoes chased the decoys instead of their intended targets. German U-boat commanders noticed the change. Their acoustic torpedoes, which had been devastating Allied escorts, suddenly missed with alarming frequency. They reported the failures to headquarters. Donitz suspected the Allies had developed some form of countermeasure, but he never connected it to U-505. He assumed the technology had been captured from a torpedo that failed to detonate, not from a submarine taken intact. The war in the Atlantic continued through the summer and fall of 1944. U-boat losses mounted. New submarines left German shipyards equipped with snorkels, devices that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged. The technology extended their underwater endurance and made them harder to detect. But the Allies had the codes. They knew where the new submarines were going before they arrived. Hunter-killer groups intercepted them in mid-ocean. Aircraft caught them during surface transits. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines for 4 years, was effectively won. Pillsbury returned to operations after repairs in Norfolk. The collision with U-505 had damaged 3 compartments, but the shipyard crews restored her within weeks. By late summer, she was back on patrol with Task Group 22.3. The hunter-killer group continued sweeping the Atlantic through the fall. They found no submarines. German U-boat activity had collapsed in the Central Ocean. The few boats still operating hugged the European coastline or lurked in distant waters where Allied air cover was thin. The war in Europe approached its end. By April 1945, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving into Germany. The Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east. Hitler's Reich was collapsing. But the U-boat war was not finished. German Naval Command had one final operation planned. A group of submarines equipped with the latest technology would cross the Atlantic and strike the American coast. The mission was desperate, a last attempt to prove that Germany could still threaten the enemy homeland. On April 8, 1945, Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk as part of a new task group. Their mission was to intercept the incoming submarines before they reached American waters. The operation was called Teardrop. Operation Teardrop was born from fear. Allied intelligence had detected a group of German submarines heading west across the Atlantic in early April 1945. The boats were Type 9 long-range submarines, capable of reaching the American coastline. But what alarmed naval planners was the cargo they might be carrying. Rumors had circulated for months about German plans to launch V-1 flying bombs or V-2 rockets from submarine platforms. The weapons had devastated London. A single V-2 striking New York or Washington could kill thousands. American intelligence could not confirm whether the approaching submarines carried such weapons, but they could not rule it out. The Navy assembled 2 barrier forces to intercept the incoming boats. Task Group 22.7 included the escort carriers Bogue and Core, along with over a dozen destroyer escorts. Pillsbury was assigned to the screen. The barrier stretched across the western Atlantic approaches, a net of ships and aircraft designed to catch any submarine attempting to reach American waters. For 2 weeks, the task group patrolled in shifting fog and heavy seas. Aircraft flew constant searches. Sonar operators listened for contacts. The submarines were out there somewhere, running silent beneath the gray swells. On April 16th, the barrier scored its first kills. Destroyer escorts located U-1235 and U-880 within hours of each other. Depth charges sent both to the bottom. 6 days later, aircraft and surface ships destroyed U-518, 3 submarines down. The barrier was working, but the Germans kept coming. On the morning of April 24th, USS Frederick C. Davis was patrolling 650 miles northwest of the Azores. At 8:29, her sonar operator reported contact. The range was 2,000 yards. A submarine was attempting to slip through the barrier. Frederick C. Davis maneuvered to attack. The contact faded, lost in her own wake. Her officer of the deck ordered a hard turn to relocate the target. At 8:39, with the submarine at only 650 yards, a torpedo struck her port side. The acoustic homing weapon detonated in the forward engine room. The explosion broke the destroyer escort in half. Her bow section sank immediately. Her stern floated for 5 minutes, while survivors scrambled into the water. 115 men died. Only 77 were rescued. Frederick C. Davis was the last American warship sunk by enemy action in the Atlantic. The submarine that killed her was U-546, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Paul Just. She had slipped through the barrier undetected, fired her torpedo at point-blank range, and now dove deep to escape. Pillsbury was 12 miles away when the distress call came. Castleman ordered flank speed. Within an hour, 8 destroyer escorts had converged on the datum point. Flaherty arrived first and made sonar contact at 9:23. She attacked with depth charges. The contact faded. The hunt lasted 10 hours. U-546 dove to 600 feet and ran silent. The destroyer escorts spread across the search area, their sonar beams probing the depths. Contact came and went. The submarine maneuvered constantly, using thermal layers and her quiet electric motors to evade detection. Pillsbury circled the perimeter while Flaherty coordinated the attacks. Chatelaine, Nunzer, Varian, Hubbard, Jansen, and Keith joined the pursuit. They dropped depth charges in overlapping patterns. They fired hedgehog salvos at suspected positions. Each attack forced U-546 deeper, but she refused to surface. By late afternoon, the submarine's batteries were nearly exhausted. She had been submerged for 8 hours. Her air was foul. Her crew was exhausted. At 1943, after a final hedgehog attack from Flaherty, U-546 blew her tanks and broke the surface. The destroyer escorts opened fire immediately. U-546's captain ordered 2 torpedoes launched at Flaherty as a final act of defiance. Both missed. Machine gun fire swept the submarine's deck. The German crew abandoned ship. 33 survivors were pulled from the water, including Captain Lieutenant Just. He was taken aboard the escort carrier Bogue for interrogation. The Navy needed to know one thing. Were there more submarines carrying secret weapons? Just had the answer. The interrogation of Captain Lieutenant Paul Just lasted for days. Navy intelligence officers pressed him about secret weapons, submarine-launched rockets, plans to strike American cities. Just answered their questions. There were no V-weapons aboard the German submarines. There never had been. The boats crossing the Atlantic carried standard torpedoes and nothing more. The mission was a final conventional attack, a desperate gesture by a dying navy. The feared rocket assault on the American homeland was a phantom. Operation Teardrop had succeeded. The barrier forces had destroyed 5 of the 7 submarines sent against the United States. U-546 was the last. The remaining 2 boats surrendered when Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945. Pillsbury was present for that surrender as well. She and her sister ship Pope escorted U-858 from mid-Atlantic to Cape May, New Jersey, after placing a prize crew aboard. The war in the Atlantic was over. The final accounting revealed the scale of Pillsbury's contribution. In 13 months of combat operations, the small destroyer escort had participated in the destruction of 2 German submarines and the capture of a 3rd. No other American warship could claim such a record. U-515 had been one of the most successful U-boats in the German Navy. Her commander, Werner Henke, had sunk 25 Allied ships totaling over 150,000 tons. Pillsbury's depth charges had forced her to the surface in April 1944. U-505 was the only German submarine captured by American forces during the entire war. The intelligence materials recovered from her hull had provided months of insight into German naval operations. The Enigma machine and codebooks had allowed Allied cryptographers to read enemy communications during the critical summer of 1944, when the Normandy invasion hung in the balance. U-546 was the last German submarine to sink an American warship. Pillsbury had joined the 10-hour hunt that brought her to the surface and ended her threat. The Navy recognized the achievement with its highest unit honor. Task Group 22.3 received the Presidential Unit Citation for the capture of U-505. The citation praised the coordinated attack, the swift boarding action, and the successful preservation of invaluable intelligence materials. Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor for leading the boarding party onto the circling submarine. His citation described how he had plunged through the conning tower hatch, fully aware that the U-boat might sink or explode at any moment. He had risked his life above and beyond the call of duty. It was the only Medal of Honor awarded to a Navy sailor in the entire Atlantic theater of World War II. 2 members of David's boarding party, Radioman Second Class Stanley Wadowiak and Torpedoman Third Class Arthur Knispel, received the Navy Cross. The remaining boarders received Silver Stars. Captain Daniel Gallery received the Legion of Merit. But the recognition came with a shadow. Admiral King had made clear that the secrecy surrounding U-505 had to hold until the war ended. Gallery had taken an enormous risk. If the capture had been revealed prematurely, if the Germans had changed their codes before D-Day, the consequences could have altered the course of the invasion. King respected Gallery's audacity, but never fully forgave the danger he had created. The captured submarine remained hidden in Bermuda until Germany surrendered. Then the Navy put her to use one final time. Repainted and restored, U-505 toured American ports as part of the 7th War Bond Drive. Citizens who purchased bonds could climb aboard and walk through the compartments where David and his men had fought to keep her afloat. The bond drive raised millions. The public finally learned the story that 3,000 sailors had kept secret for nearly a year. After the war, the Navy had no further use for the submarine. Plans were made to tow her out to sea and sink her with gunfire, a target for gunnery practice. She would disappear beneath the Atlantic like the hundreds of other U-boats destroyed during the war. But Gallery had other ideas. The submarine that his men had risked their lives to capture deserved a different fate. Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery, as he had become after the war, launched a campaign to save U-505. He contacted civic leaders in Chicago, his hometown. He proposed that the submarine be transported to the city and displayed as a permanent memorial to the Battle of the Atlantic. The Museum of Science and Industry agreed to host the exhibit. But getting the submarine to Chicago required moving a 750-ton vessel from the Atlantic Ocean to the shore of Lake Michigan. The journey would cover over 1,000 miles, much of it overland. In 1954, engineers floated U-505 down the Atlantic coast, through the Gulf of Mexico, and up the Mississippi River system to Chicago. The final leg required hauling the submarine across city streets on specially constructed rollers. Thousands of Chicagoans lined the route to watch the German U-boat creep past their homes and businesses. On September 25, 1954, Fleet Admiral William Halsey dedicated U-505 as a permanent war memorial. She was placed outdoors on the museum grounds, where visitors could climb aboard and walk through the same compartments that Albert David and his men had entered a decade earlier. David himself never saw the memorial. He died of a heart attack on September 17, 1945, 3 weeks before he was scheduled to receive the Medal of Honor. He was 43 years old. President Harry Truman presented the medal to his widow, Linda May David, at a White House ceremony the following month. The Navy honored David's memory by naming a destroyer escort after him. USS Albert David was commissioned in 1968 and served until 1990. George Castleman returned to civilian life after the war. The lieutenant commander who had watched 2 submarines sink and ordered the boarding of a third resumed a quiet existence far from the Atlantic. Like most veterans of his generation, he rarely spoke of what he had done. Pillsbury herself served until 1947, when she was decommissioned and placed in reserve. The Navy brought her back in 1955, converted to a radar picket ship for Cold War duty along the Atlantic Barrier. She patrolled for Soviet submarines until 1960, then was decommissioned a final time. She was sold for scrap in 1966. No monument marks her service. No museum displays her artifacts. The ship that participated in the only submarine capture by American forces since 1815 exists now only in photographs and official records. But U-505 endures. In 2004, the Museum of Science and Industry completed a major renovation. The submarine was moved indoors to a climate-controlled underground exhibit hall. Visitors can now tour her interior, preserved almost exactly as she appeared when David's men came through the conning tower hatch. The Medal of Honor that David never lived to receive is displayed alongside the submarine. So are the Enigma machines his team recovered, the code books that unlocked German communications, the acoustic torpedoes that revealed enemy secrets. Over 30 million people have visited the exhibit since 1954. They walk through the control room where David searched for demolition charges. They see the valve that Trocino closed to stop the flooding. They stand in the compartments where 8 American sailors saved a sinking enemy vessel through courage and determination. The capture of U-505 remains the only time the United States Navy boarded and seized an enemy warship at sea since the War of 1812. It has never happened again. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about sailors who jumped onto sinking submarines and changed the course of the war. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Navy. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Albert David, George Castleman, and the crew of USS Pillsbury do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. At 1447, on August 18, 1944, Lieutenant Royce Priest watched his squadron commander's P-51 Mustang erupt in flames over occupied France. Black smoke pouring from the engine as the crippled fighter dropped toward a wheat field 20 miles behind German lines. 21 years old, 2 months of combat, and the man he idolized was about to become a prisoner of war. The Germans had hidden a flak battery inside a railcar. When Major Bert Marshall led his 4-ship flight in for a strafing run near Saint-Étienne, the sides of the boxcar dropped away and revealed 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns already tracking their approach. The ambush caught the formation at point-blank range. By August 1944, the 8th Air Force was losing pilots at an alarming rate over France. German flak batteries had become masters of concealment. They disguised gun positions as haystacks, farm buildings, and now railway cars marked with Red Cross symbols. American fighters flying low-altitude strafing missions faced a gauntlet of hidden fire. The 355th Fighter Group alone had lost 17 pilots in the previous 2 months. Some were killed instantly. Others belly-landed in enemy territory and spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft prison camps. A few simply vanished, their fates never confirmed. Major Marshall was not supposed to be flying that day. As the 354th Fighter Squadron's commanding officer, he could have delegated the mission to his flight leaders, but Marshall had a reputation for leading from the front. He had arrived at the squadron in early June with only 3 hours of P-51 flight time after transitioning from the P-40. His second combat mission was D-Day itself. On June 6th, he shot down a German Ju-87 Stuka over the Normandy beaches. 2 weeks later, he destroyed 2 Bf-109s. By early August, he had 5 confirmed kills, making him an ace in the shortest time in the history of the 355th Fighter Group. His aggressive flying style earned him rapid promotions. Pilot to flight leader in days. Flight leader to operations officer in 2 weeks. Operations officer to squadron commander in under 2 months. Now that same aggressive style had put him in a burning cockpit over enemy territory. Lieutenant Priest had known of Burt Marshall long before the war. Marshall had been a 3-time All-State quarterback in Texas high school football and an honorable mention All-American at Vanderbilt University. When Priest discovered they were assigned to the same squadron, he considered it the luckiest break of his military career. He had studied Marshall's tactics, copied his maneuvers, and tried to absorb everything the older pilot could teach him. Priest watched Marshall's Mustang trail fire as it descended. The P-51's Merlin engine had taken a direct hit below the exhaust stack. A second round had punctured the radiator scoop, and coolant was hemorrhaging into the slipstream. The aircraft had minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less. The standard procedure was clear. When a pilot went down behind enemy lines, his wingmen were supposed to note the location, radio the coordinates to search and rescue, and return to base. Attempting a pickup was not just discouraged, it was considered impossible. The P-51 Mustang was a single-seat fighter. There was no room for passengers. There was no protocol for landing in enemy wheat fields. There was no training for what Lieutenant Priest was about to do. If you want to see how Priest's impossible decision turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Priest. Marshall's burning Mustang disappeared below the tree line. Priest pushed his control stick forward and began his descent toward the same wheat field. His radio crackled with an order from Marshall. The squadron commander was telling him to abort. Priest's hand moved to the radio switch. He could acknowledge the order and turn for England. He could follow procedure and let the Germans take Marshall. His hand stopped. He had already made his choice. The P-51 Mustang was never designed to land in wheat fields. Its liquid-cooled Packard Merlin engine sat low in the fuselage, with the radiator scoop extending beneath the belly. Any obstruction taller than 18 inches could rupture the coolant system and destroy the engine. The retractable landing gear was built for paved runways, not soft French farmland. A single rut or hidden rock could collapse a strut and flip the aircraft onto its back. Priest ignored all of this. He dropped his flaps to 40 degrees, cut his airspeed to 90 miles per hour, and lined up on the longest stretch of golden wheat he could find. The Mustang's nose blocked his forward view during the descent. He had to judge his approach by looking out the side of the canopy, estimating his height above the grain by the blur of stalks rushing past his wingtip. The wheels touched down hard. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled into the soft earth. Wheat stalks whipped against the fuselage as Priest stood on the brakes. The Mustang slowed, shuddered, and finally stopped 300 yards from the tree line where Marshall's burning aircraft had disappeared. Priest immediately swung the fighter around to face the direction he had come. If he needed to take off in a hurry, he could not afford to waste time turning. The wheat field stretched roughly 800 yards in the direction of the wind. It would have to be enough. Above him, the 2 remaining pilots from his flight circled at 1,500 feet. They had watched his landing with disbelief. Now they scanned the roads and hedgerows for any sign of German response. The answer came within seconds. A military truck had appeared on a dirt road half a mile to the east, moving fast toward the wheat field. The canvas cover over the truck bed meant infantry. Priest estimated 20 to 30 soldiers based on the vehicle's size. The 2 Mustangs overhead rolled into their attack runs without hesitation. Their 650 caliber machine guns, Each could fire 14 rounds per second. The lead pilot opened fire at 400 yards, walking his tracers across the road and into the truck's engine compartment. The vehicle swerved, caught fire, and rolled into a ditch. The second Mustang strafed the wreckage to ensure no survivors would reach the field. But the circling pilot spotted more movement. A second truck was approaching from the north. A motorcycle with a sidecar had appeared on a farm track to the south. German patrols were converging on the crash site from multiple directions. The clock was running. Priest stood in his cockpit and searched the tree line for Marshall. Smoke rose from the woods where the squadron commander had gone down. Marshall would have destroyed his aircraft by now. Every pilot carried thermite grenades specifically to incinerate crashed fighters and prevent their technology from falling into enemy hands. The Mustang's Merlin engine, its K-14 gun sight, its IFF transponder, all of it had to burn. 2 minutes passed. The Mustangs overhead made another strafing run on the approaching motorcycle, scattering its riders into a hedgerow. Priest calculated his remaining time. The soft ground had left deep ruts behind his wheels. Taking off would require full power in every inch of the field. Adding a second man's weight to a single-seat cockpit would raise his stall speed and extend his takeoff roll. The mathematics were brutal. He might not have enough runway. 3 minutes. Still no sign of Marshall. The second truck had stopped a quarter-mile away. Priest could see soldiers dismounting, spreading into a skirmish line, beginning to advance through the wheat on foot. Then a figure emerged from the tree line. Major Burt Marshall was running toward the Mustang, his flight suit blackened with soot, his face twisted with anger. He was waving his arms, not in greeting, in fury. He was ordering Priest to leave without him. Priest did the only thing he could think of. He climbed out of the cockpit, unbuckled his parachute harness, and dropped it onto the wing. Then he removed his survival dinghy and tossed it into the wheat. Without a parachute, he could not bail out if the engine failed on the flight home. Without the dinghy, he would drown if they went down over the English Channel. He was making his intentions unmistakable. He was not leaving France without his commanding officer. Marshall stopped running. He stood 50 yards from the aircraft, staring at the discarded equipment on the wing. The German soldiers were now visible above the wheat, their helmets bobbing as they pushed through the stalks. The Mustangs overhead had exhausted most of their ammunition on the trucks. They could make one more strafing pass, maybe two, before their guns ran dry. Marshall sprinted the final distance to the aircraft. The cockpit of a P-51D Mustang measured 38 inches wide and 42 inches from the seat to the canopy rail. The space was designed for one pilot wearing a parachute, a survival vest, and a seat-pack dinghy. It was not designed for two full-grown men. Marshall was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed approximately 170 pounds. Priest was slightly smaller, but still filled the standard flight gear dimensions. Together, they would occupy a space meant for a single human being. Marshall climbed onto the wing first. He lowered himself into the cockpit and slid as far down as possible, his back pressed against the armored seat plate, his legs extended beneath the instrument panel alongside the control stick. Priest climbed in after him, settling onto Marshall's lap with his own legs straddling his commander's thighs. Their bodies compressed together like cargo in a shipping crate. The control stick jutted up between Priest's knees, his shoulders pressed against Marshall's chest. Their heads nearly touched the canopy glass. Priest reached up and pulled the canopy closed. It latched with less than an inch of clearance above his flight helmet. The two men could barely breathe in the confined space. The August heat inside the greenhouse canopy was suffocating. Sweat immediately began soaking through their flight suits. The instrument panel was partially blocked by Priest's knees, but he could see the essential gauges: fuel pressure, oil temperature, manifold pressure. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the Merlin engine surge to full power. 1,200 horsepower roared through the airframe. The propeller clawed at the air, pulling the overloaded Mustang forward through the wheat. The aircraft accelerated slowly, too slowly. The combined weight of two pilots, full ammunition, and remaining fuel pushed the Mustang far beyond its designed gross weight. The soft ground dragged at the wheels. Wheat stalks battered the radiator scoop beneath the fuselage. Priest watched his airspeed climb. 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The tree line at the end of the field rushed toward them. A P-51 Mustang normally lifted off at approximately 100 miles per hour. With the additional weight, Priest estimated he would need at least 115. His airspeed indicator showed 95 as the trees filled his windscreen. He pulled back on the stick and felt the wheels leave the ground. The aircraft staggered into the air, barely climbing, the stall warning horn screaming in his ears. The treetops passed beneath them by what felt like inches. Branches scraped against the belly of the aircraft. Then they were clear, climbing slowly over the French countryside. Two men crammed into a single-seat fighter, alive against every reasonable expectation. Behind them, German soldiers emerged from the wheat field and watched the Mustang disappear to the west. Their quarry had escaped, but Priest and Marshall were still 200 miles from England. The aircraft was dangerously overweight. The engine was overheating from the strain, and somewhere ahead, German fighters were hunting for stragglers. The two remaining Mustangs from the flight formed up on either side of Priest's aircraft as they climbed to 8,000 feet. Their role had shifted from combat to escort. With their ammunition nearly depleted, they could not engage enemy fighters, but they could watch for threats and guide the overloaded aircraft home. Priest leveled off and reduced power to cruise settings. The engine temperature gauge had been climbing steadily since takeoff, and he needed to cool the Merlin before it seized. The radiator scoop beneath the fuselage had ingested wheat stalks and debris during the ground roll. Airflow through the cooling system was partially blocked. The needle crept toward the red line with every passing minute. The flight path to England crossed 180 miles of occupied France before reaching the Channel coast. German flak batteries dotted the route. Luftwaffe airfields at Évreux, Dreux, and Beauvais could scramble interceptors within minutes if spotters reported American aircraft. Priest kept his altitude low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to glide to a landing if the engine failed. Inside the cockpit, the heat was becoming unbearable. The canopy acted like a greenhouse, trapping the August sun. Both men were drenched in sweat. Marshall's position beneath Priest meant he absorbed the full weight of his rescuer pressing down on his legs. Circulation was cut off within minutes. His feet went numb first, then his calves, then his thighs. He could not shift position even an inch. The confined space locked them both in place like prisoners in a medieval torture device. Priest focused on flying. The control stick moved between his knees with limited range of motion. His elbows were pinned against his ribs by the narrow cockpit walls. Every input required careful precision. A sudden movement could jam the stick against Marshall's legs and send the aircraft into a roll. The escort pilots watched the engine cowling of Priest's Mustang with growing concern. Coolant was beginning to stream from the radiator, leaving a white trail in the slipstream. The Merlin engine was slowly cooking itself. They estimated 15 to 20 minutes before catastrophic failure if the temperature continued rising. Priest spotted the problem on his gauges. He had two options. He could reduce power further and extend his flight time, but risk not reaching the channel before nightfall. Or he could maintain speed and hope the engine held together long enough to reach friendly territory. He chose speed. Better to crash in the channel, where rescue boats patrolled, than to go down over occupied France, where German patrols would be waiting. The French coastline appeared after 47 minutes of flight. The white cliffs of the Cotentin Peninsula passed beneath them, still held by Allied forces following the Normandy breakout. Priest allowed himself a moment of relief. They had cleared occupied territory. If the engine quit now, they would land among friends. The channel stretched ahead, 21 miles of cold gray water between France and England. Priest had discarded his dinghy in the wheat field. Marshall had abandoned his with the burning aircraft. If they went down in the water, neither man would survive more than a few minutes in the frigid current. The engine temperature gauge touched the red line as they crossed the halfway point. Priest watched the needle quiver at the upper limit, waiting for the sudden silence that would mean the Merlin had finally surrendered. The coastline of England appeared through the haze, white cliffs, green fields, the distinctive outline of the Isle of Wight to the east. The Mustang crossed the English coast with its engine still running. Priest began his descent towards Steeple Morden, the 355th Fighter Group's home base in Cambridgeshire. The runway was still 60 miles ahead. The engine temperature was still climbing. He had saved his commander from the Germans. Now he had to save them both from the aircraft. The Mustang's engine began misfiring 12 miles from Steeple Morden. The steady roar of the Merlin fractured into an irregular stutter as overheated cylinders started failing. Priest enriched the fuel mixture and prayed the engine would hold together for another 5 minutes. The airfield appeared through the summer haze. 2 concrete runways formed an X pattern across the Cambridgeshire farmland. Fire trucks and ambulances were already positioning along the main strip. The tower had received radio reports from the escort pilots. Everyone at Steeple Morden knew that an impossible aircraft was inbound. Priest entered the landing pattern at 140 miles per hour, far faster than normal. The overweight Mustang needed the extra speed to maintain lift. He dropped his landing gear and felt the reassuring thunk of the wheels locking into place. Flaps came down in stages. 40 degrees. The aircraft ballooned slightly, then settled. The runway rushed up to meet them. Priest flared the aircraft and felt the main wheels touch concrete. The tail dropped. The Mustang rolled down the center line, decelerating smoothly, the engine coughing and sputtering, but still turning. He applied the brakes and brought the aircraft to a stop halfway down the runway. Ground crews sprinted toward the Mustang before the propeller stopped spinning. They expected to find a wounded pilot, perhaps a dying man who had somehow nursed his crippled aircraft home. What they found was something no one had ever seen before. 2 pilots unfolded themselves from a single cockpit, like circus performers emerging from an impossibly small box. Marshall could not walk. His legs had been compressed beneath Priest's weight for nearly 2 hours. The circulation had been cut off so completely that he collapsed when he tried to stand on the wing. Ground crew members carried him to a waiting ambulance. Priest climbed down under his own power, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The news spread through the 355th Fighter Group within minutes. Pilots gathered around the aircraft to examine the evidence. Wheat stalks protruded from every opening in the airframe. The radiator scoop was packed with vegetation and debris. Oil streaked the cowling where the overheated engine had begun leaking. The ground crew chief estimated that the Merlin had been within seconds of seizing when Priest shut it down. Mechanics spent 2 days cleaning the aircraft. They extracted wheat stubble from the landing gear wells, the tailwheel housing, the radiator fins, and the gun ports. The radiator itself required complete disassembly to remove the packed debris. Several coolant lines had to be replaced. The engine needed a full inspection and partial rebuild. The rescue was unprecedented in the history of the 8th Air Force. Other pilots had attempted similar landings to retrieve downed comrades. Most had ended in disaster. Aircraft had flipped on soft ground, crashed into obstacles, or been destroyed by enemy fire before takeoff. No one had successfully landed a single-seat fighter behind enemy lines, loaded a second pilot into the cockpit, and flown home. Word of Priest's action reached Group Headquarters that evening. By morning, it had spread to 8th Air Force Command. The story presented military leadership with an uncomfortable problem. Lieutenant Priest had directly disobeyed a lawful order from his commanding officer, in combat, twice. He had risked a valuable aircraft and his own life on an unauthorized rescue attempt. Every regulation and procedure said he should face court-martial, but he had also saved the life of one of the most promising squadron commanders in the European theater. Major Burt Marshall was an ace with 5 confirmed kills. He was a proven combat leader with aggressive tactics that inspired his men. His capture would have been a significant loss. The question landed on the desk of Major General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. The same man who had led the famous raid on Tokyo in 1942 now had to decide the fate of a young lieutenant who had done something simultaneously heroic and insubordinate. General James Doolittle had faced impossible decisions before. In April 1942, he had launched 16 B-25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, knowing that none of them could return. Every plane had crash-landed or been abandoned when fuel ran out. 8 crewmen were captured by the Japanese. 3 were executed. Doolittle himself had expected court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. Now he confronted a mirror image of that situation. A young pilot had risked everything on an unauthorized mission and succeeded. The parallel was uncomfortable. Doolittle requested the full after-action reports from the 355th Fighter Group. He reviewed the radio transcripts, the witness statements from the escort pilots, and the maintenance logs documenting the condition of Priest's aircraft. The evidence was unambiguous. Lieutenant Priest had received a direct order from Major Marshall to abort the rescue attempt. He had acknowledged the order. Then, he had ignored it and landed anyway. When Marshall repeated the order on the ground, Priest had ignored it again. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was clear. Disobeying a lawful order in combat was a court-martial offense. The punishment could range from reduction in rank to imprisonment. In extreme cases, it could mean execution. The regulations existed for good reason. Military operations depended on the chain of command. If every pilot made independent decisions based on personal judgment, coordinated action became impossible. But Doolittle also understood something the regulations could not capture. The 8th Air Force was losing pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Every experienced aviator who survived another mission increased the odds for the men around him. Marshall was not just any pilot. He was a squadron commander, an ace, a tactical innovator whose aggressive style had influenced the entire fighter group. His capture would have damaged morale across the command. There was another consideration. The war was entering a critical phase. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The Luftwaffe was weakening, but still dangerous. American pilots needed to believe that their comrades would not abandon them if they went down. Priest's rescue demonstrated something powerful. It showed that the bonds between pilots could transcend orders, regulations, and personal risk. Doolittle weighed these factors for 3 days. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed the precedents for similar situations. There were none that matched exactly. Other pilots had attempted rescues behind enemy lines. All had failed. Some had resulted in 2 prisoners instead of 1. Others had ended with crashed aircraft and dead pilots. Priest was the first to succeed. The general made his decision. He would not court-martial Lieutenant Priest. Instead, he would recommend him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. The recommendation would acknowledge both the extraordinary courage of the rescue and the unprecedented nature of the achievement. But Doolittle added a caveat. He was uncomfortable with the message that a Medal of Honor might send. If other pilots attempted similar rescues and failed, the cost would be measured in lives and aircraft. The 8th Air Force could not afford to encourage unauthorized heroics. Every pilot who landed behind enemy lines on a rescue attempt was gambling not just his own life, but the resources of his unit. Doolittle revised his recommendation. Instead of the Medal of Honor, he proposed the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation would praise Priest's courage and skill, while implicitly acknowledging that his actions, however successful, should not become standard practice. The paperwork moved through channels. 8th Air Force Headquarters approved the recommendation and forwarded it to Washington. A ceremony was scheduled at Steeple Morden for late September. Lieutenant Priest would receive his medal from General Doolittle personally. The general planned to deliver a message along with the decoration. He wanted Priest to understand exactly why the Medal of Honor had been withheld. The ceremony took place on September 21, 1944, at Steeple Morden. Pilots from all 3 squadrons of the 355th Fighter Group assembled on the flight line. Ground crews paused their work to watch. The group commander stood beside General Doolittle as Lieutenant Priest marched forward to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Doolittle pinned the medal to Priest's chest. The blue ribbon with red and white stripes hung below the silver cross. It was the same decoration Doolittle himself had received for the Tokyo raid, before being upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The general held Priest's hand for a moment after the pinning. He looked the young lieutenant in the eyes and delivered the message he had planned. He had never considered issuing a regulation prohibiting pilots from landing behind enemy lines to rescue comrades. The idea seemed so reckless, so fundamentally impossible, that no reasonable person would attempt it. Priest had proven that assumption wrong. What he had done was simultaneously the bravest and most foolish action Doolittle had witnessed in 2 years of commanding the 8th Air Force. The medal recognized the bravery. The decision to withhold the Medal of Honor acknowledged the foolishness. Priest accepted the decoration without protest. He had expected court-martial, not commendation. The Distinguished Service Cross was more than he had dared hope for. In a letter written decades later to Burt Marshall's son, he admitted that the uncertainty about his fate had been the most stressful part of the entire experience. The flight itself had been terrifying. The waiting afterward had been worse. The rescue entered 8th Air Force legend as the first successful piggyback extraction in a P-51 Mustang. It would not be the last. Priest's example inspired other pilots to attempt similar rescues over the following months. On August 28th, 10 days after Priest's flight, another 355th Fighter Group pilot landed in occupied France to rescue a downed comrade. His aircraft became stuck in mud. Both pilots evaded capture and eventually returned to Allied lines on foot. On October 3rd, 2 more rescue attempts occurred on the same day. One pilot successfully extracted his wingman in a single-seat fighter. The other became mired in soft ground. Both he and the pilot he tried to rescue were captured by German forces. The mathematics of the gamble were becoming clear. Some rescues succeeded. Others doubled the losses. The 20th Fighter Group recorded a successful piggyback rescue on November 18, 1944. First Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey landed his P-51 in a pasture and extracted his wingman under enemy fire. The 4th Fighter Group added another on March 18, 1945, when a pilot rescued Captain William McKinnon from occupied Germany. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had documented at least 5 successful single-seat fighter rescues. An unknown number of attempts had failed, resulting in additional casualties and lost aircraft. The tactic remained officially unauthorized. No regulation ever endorsed or prohibited it. Commanders simply looked the other way when pilots made the choice to risk everything for their comrades. Major Burt Marshall returned to combat duty within days of the rescue. His legs recovered fully from the circulation loss. He continued leading the 354th Fighter Squadron through the fall of 1944, adding to his victory count and earning a Silver Star for his leadership. By October, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed deputy commander of the 355th Fighter Group. When another rescue attempt in his squadron resulted in 2 pilots being captured, Marshall felt the weight of the precedent Priest had established. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Marshall had survived. Priest had survived. The aircraft that carried them both to safety had been repaired and returned to service, flying additional combat missions until Germany's surrender. But the story of that August afternoon in a French wheat field was only beginning. Both men would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Colonel Royce Priest retired from the United States Air Force in 1968 after 28 years of service. His career had taken him from the wheat fields of France to the mountains of South America. He served 3 years as personal pilot to the President of Chile, where he met his wife Anita. He trained fighter pilots for Allied nations. He flew jets that would have seemed like science fiction to the young lieutenant who landed a propeller-driven Mustang behind enemy lines. The Distinguished Service Cross remained his most prized possession. He rarely spoke about the rescue unless asked directly. When he did discuss it, he deflected praise toward the 2 escort pilots whose strafing runs had bought him time, and toward the ground crews who rebuilt his damaged aircraft. He considered himself fortunate, not heroic. Lieutenant Colonel Burt Marshall finished the war as commander of the 355th Fighter Group. His final tally included 7 confirmed aerial victories. The Silver Star he received recognized his leadership of the 354th Fighter Squadron during some of the most intense air combat of the European theater. After the war, he continued his Air Force career, eventually commanding fighter wings in Japan during the occupation. His 3-time All-State quarterback record in Texas high school football was inducted into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 1971. The 2 men remained friends for the rest of their lives. Their bond had been forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one man, flying over enemy territory with a dying engine and no parachutes. That kind of experience does not fade with time. In December 2002, Colonel Priest wrote a letter to Bill Marshall, Burt's son. The letter contained the most detailed account of the rescue ever recorded. Priest described the hidden flak battery, the burning Mustang, the desperate landing, and the agonizing flight home. He wrote about the fear he had felt waiting to learn whether he would face court-martial. He wrote about the moment General Doolittle pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his chest. Most importantly, he wrote about why he had done it. Burt Marshall had been his hero long before the war. The chance to serve in his squadron had felt like destiny. When Marshall's aircraft caught fire over France, Priest had not calculated the odds or weighed the regulations. He had simply refused to let his hero die in a German prison camp. Colonel Royce Priest passed away on May 18, 2004, in Riverside, California. He was 81 years old. His obituary identified him as one of the few remaining World War II fighter aces and recipient of the nation's second highest award for valor. It mentioned his service in Chile, his long Air Force career, and his devotion to his wife and family. It did not mention that he had once squeezed 2 men into a single-seat fighter and flown them home through enemy territory. Some stories are too extraordinary for obituaries. The P-51 Mustang that carried Priest and Marshall to safety was never preserved as a memorial. It served out the war, was likely sold as surplus, and disappeared into history like thousands of other warbirds. No museum displays a plaque commemorating the first piggyback rescue in 8th Air Force history. But the story survived. It passed from pilot to pilot, from veteran to historian, from father to son. Bill Marshall wrote 2 books about his father's squadron. Both included accounts of the rescue that saved his father's life. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who risked everything for their comrades. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Royce Priest and Burt Marshall do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.